So I think because we'll rotate it. Yeah. Okay. We'll just switch chairs. All right. Hi, everyone. How are you? First day of SAEM. We made it. Well, we've kind of made it through the pandemic. You know what I mean. But I'm super excited that you all could join our session. We're really delighted to be here with you all today to talk about a topic that can sometimes be elusive, but even more importantly, thinking about after you hit submit, which sometimes we give even less attention to, but hopefully we'll load you with some ideas and suggestions and strategies from having been on the back end of doing the research, being reviewers, in terms of key interventions you can use to hopefully make this process, even after you hit submit, more effective for you. So my name is Ngaruiya. These are my esteemed colleagues, Dr. Stephanie Carreiro and Dr. Chai, who will be introducing themselves a little bit later. And these are our disclosures. And as you saw in the program, these are our learning objectives for today. So we'll start with taking you through a continuum of the events. That's okay, you could go. I'm going to try to get a clicker going if we can. But we'll start by going over the continuum of events in the NIH peer review process, which hopefully some of you are at least somewhat familiar with. Just walking you through the different steps of review, so that's more familiar for you. You're able to recognize what different things mean at different phases, and hopefully able to respond more effectively because of that. We'll also, oh, it's working. Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
We appreciate you. All right, next up, very important, communication, okay? Communicating with your POs or program officers, which we'll talk about even more in detail, is also very key and something that I think many of us, even individually on the panel, didn't necessarily effectively leverage in our careers early on. And so we want to make sure that that's not the case for you, that you take away the best practices to be able to hopefully engage with these individuals as you go through the process. We'll also talk about contextualizing what it means when you get your different reviews back or when you're going through different aspects of the review, again, to hopefully demystify it a bit more for you and again, hopefully make us all more successful in EM in securing those grants. We'll start with introductions. Definitely have time for questions at the end, but please do stop us. We want to make this as discussion leaning as possible, albeit within 50 minutes. But we want to hear from you because I'm sure there are lots of probably burning questions. And the whole idea is to hopefully make ourselves available today, but thereafter, and also to learn from others in the room who've, I'm sure, gone through different aspects of this as well. So introductions. I'll go ahead and start. My name is Ngaruiya, as you see on the title. I'm from Kenya. I'm showcasing some beautiful Kenyan wear today, if anyone's curious. I'm originally from Kenya, and most of my research is actually on global health. So I've been working in Africa for the past 6 years, during the same amount of time I've been on faculty at Yale. And just a little bit on my sort of origin story in research. So I, like some of you in the room, came to this with no K, off the general common track for a lot of people who get into research, and if that's you in the room, that's okay. I did have some foundation funding, I had a little bit of institutional funding, and went straight to 2 R21s. Became one of the top 100 nationally funded EM researchers for the past 2 years, and I just submitted my 2 R01s this year. And that's sort of my origin story coming into this. And again, I'm very passionate about breaking it down for people who are like me, who didn't really have that general common trajectory through the K, et cetera else. It's possible. And then just briefly on my review background, so when I'm speaking about review, where that comes from and contextualizing my experience for you. So I've sat on a number of what are called special emphasis panels. So I'm not on a standard peer review group, which you'll hear from others that they have been. I'm on what's called I've been on 3 special emphasis panels, invited to others, a lot of work, which we'll talk about, but we want to encourage more to be on. And these are specifically around special announcements that come out where they bring together folks like an EM to provide your key experience on a topic area on a review panel, which again we can talk a little bit about more. With that, I'm going to turn over to Dr. Chai. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Cool. Thank you guys all for coming, and thanks Christine for organizing this. My name is Peter Chai. I am at Brigham and Women's. I did my fellowship in medical toxicology at UMass, where I had a lot of mentorship around research. I think maybe similar to Christine, I finished residency and I thought I was just going to work clinically and not do research, but I had some great mentors that convinced me otherwise, and here I am now. And so my interest is really in leveraging different types of technologies that are ubiquitous and some less so to understand health behavior change in an emergency department and outside in the outpatient setting. And so my lab today does a lot of stuff from preclinical. We do animal models, we translate into humans. We do a lot of first-in-man phase 1 studies that are regulated by the FDA. And we also do a lot of kind of behavioral science stuff on top of all of that. And I'm funded by the NIH, but also I have a lot of defense funding and foundation stuff through the Gates Foundation. And my review experience, I have been an ad hoc reviewer for several NIH panels, mostly around small business, but also through NIDA, which is my main NIH funder. And I've been chair of study section a few times as well, so I can speak to kind of that experience and the real importance of being really nice to your PO and your reviewers. So
Cool.
Pass on to Steph.
Awesome. All right. Well, so I'm Stephanie Carreiro. I'm also an emergency physician and I'm a toxicologist. I did my residency at Brown and then my fellowship at UMass, and I've stayed there ever since because I've been fortunate enough to have really great mentorship around research. I actually started my research career in residency in animal models. I thought I was going to be the person who had a big animal lab and did all this basic science stuff. And then I've actually transitioned mostly because I started working on things with my mentor, and my research program now is really focused on digital health. So I develop digital diagnostics and digital therapeutics for substance use disorder, mostly using things like wearable sensors and machine learning applications to figure out how we can understand when people with substance use disorder are at risk for things like relapse and overdose or even the onset of dependence, and then how we can use digital tools to intervene on them. And my road has been a little bit, it's been sort of interesting like everyone else's. I applied for my very first grant as a resident and I didn't get it. And then I applied for more grants that I didn't get. But I stuck with it again because I had people kind of helping me through. And I got a couple of industry and foundation or industry and internal grants first. And I think my first big NIH break was actually through the NIH loan repayment program, which as an aside, if anyone has student loans left over and didn't do this big full forgiveness thing, I'm happy to talk about that. That was fantastic. But then I started, sort of helped me learn how to write grants in the NIH style. I received a KL2, which is an internal K award from my institution, and then I got a K23. I've had a couple of SBIR, which are also small business research awards, where I partner with a business to do the research to develop their products. And then most recently with Peer, I have an R25, which is an educational grant, and some other irons in the fire at NIH. So my primary institute is NIDA because of the tox stuff, but I also have some funding from NIBIB, which is Bioengineering and Electrical Engineering Institute. In terms of review experience, so I've sat on about 15 study sections, all ad hoc, which is sort of those kind of arranged as sort of one-offs, but you do get re-invited a lot of the time to similar panels. I'm not on a standing study section as of yet. And I do chair a review panel for the Medical Toxicology Foundation grant, so I have some experience there too. And again, I think I was super excited when Christine asked us to do this because I think my grant writing got so much better when I became a reviewer. Just like manuscript reviewing helps you write better papers. I think when you understand this process from the reviewer perspective, it just changes everything for you. So you guys are probably a step ahead of where I was, but I really didn't know anything about it until I hopped in. So before we actually jump into the meat of it, we kind of wanted to figure out who was here in the audience. I see a lot of familiar faces, and from the people I know, there's a lot of different phases. So can we just, by show of hands, just let us know who's applied for a grant before? Awesome. Okay, fantastic. I boy, you have to review. And is anyone sat on a review panel before? Perfect. Okay. For the folks who have been on a review panel, have there been NIH review panels mostly, or anything else? Other review panels?
I sit on the funding committee for R2HC research for health and humanitarian crises.
Okay, cool. All right, so we have, it's kind of a variety of experience in the room. And for the folks who have sat on NIH review panels, feel free, at the end, maybe we can hear some of your experiences and see other stuff. I think that every time I sit on one, I learn something new. So it's really sort of a great process. So we're going to start just sort of describing the continuum events in the NIH peer review process. So after you hit submit, what happens? And the first thing I'll tell you that I guess I didn't know when I started this was you put all this work in, super excited, you hit submit, and then you're gonna wait, and you're gonna wait a long time. This probably can go from the time you hit submit to this time you will get the award, right? Because we're gonna assume everyone's gonna get all the awards you submit. It can be up to a year or more, and so you really have to be patient and just be ready for that. And I think that sort of adds to the frustration, especially when you're newer at this, so just sort of anticipate that. And as we go through, you'll probably at least see some of the reasons why it takes so long, because there are a lot of steps in the process. And so the first level of review that I'll talk about is the scientific review group, or the infamous study section, right? These are those people that write develop those summary statements that you get at the end that you always want to tear up because you're mad because they said about your grant or whatever. And this is basically a panel of people, usually upwards of like 30 people or so. There's usually a chair, if not a couple of chairs, that organize them. And they meet together for a marathon of grant review. And so these study section, the actual meetings are usually 1, sometimes 2 8-hour days. They can be in person, or they can, most recently be virtual. But they review tons of applications, and so the goal for you is always to have your application obviously flip to the top of the pile. But we'll talk a little bit about what actually goes into before that meeting, and then how that meeting actually works out. And so the first question people ask is like, who are these mysterious people on this study sector, right? Who are those people that are making decisions about your life and your funding? And the truth is, they're people just like us, right? And so, this is a typical roster for an NIH study section. And for standing study sections, the rosters are published ahead of time, so you can find them online. And this is important when you're thinking about what study section should I ask for my grant to go to. Look at the roster, figure out who has expertise. There are some emergency physicians, and I always get really excited when I see EM docs on the roster with me. There aren't a lot, though, and so one of the things we're going to ask you guys to do in terms of a call to action at end is think about getting yourself on a study section, and we'll tell you how to do that. But we need more representation because we need voices in that room to tell why what we're doing is important to help understand. And you can see this is a shout out to Peter, who recently became chair of a study section. God bless him. That's a really intense job. He has to corral the whole review committee. But you'll see names that you recognize. If you see names from your institution, know that they have to recuse. So before you get to sit on a study section, you have to look at all of the grant applications, every investigator, every person who wrote a letter for them. And if you have conflicts of interest, either they're at your institution or you've worked with them before, you have to recuse from those applications. So people you actually know won't be reviewing your application, but people in your specialty might, which actually is a benefit to you. So I think that when you start out, it sort of feels like, I do all this work, and then there's this black box, and then I get out a piece of paper that tells me all the things that are wrong with my grant. Let's get the summary statements. But there's actually a lot more going on, and so we're just going to try to take a minute to kind of demystify what happens in that middle, how you get to that summary statement. And so the first, I talked a little bit about who is on that panel. The way that they actually get recruited is through scientific review offices at the NIH. They have lists of investigators. They're mostly people who have NIH grants, principal investigators, co-investigators, and then some other people with specialty expertise. And what the SRO is looking for is looking to assemble a panel that has the right expertise to evaluate all the pieces of the grants that are in there. So some of the people might be biostatisticians, right? Some of them might have technical expertise like computer science, or in my case, there's always someone who does machine learning, whether it's a computer scientist or an engineer. There might be people with methodological expertise, right? Qualitative experts, or whatever the case may be. And then in the case of the small business owners, there are actually people from industry. So sometimes there are, CEOs of various companies that may not have any academic expertise, but they're there to think about, like, is this a commercially feasible, if that's a review criteria. So it is a really diverse group of people, and that usually works in your interest if they understand your proposal. But do know that when you read those 3 reviews on your summary statements, they're coming from different perspectives, right? Like the statistician is going to look at this one way, whereas the clinician is going to look at it a different way. So these people get recruited. They get an email from the SRO asking, or really begging them to come serve on this study section. And it's a lot of work. When they agree to it, they commit for, it's pretty much volunteer work. They pay you like $200 a day or something. It's pretty much volunteer work. And they'll put in, so they usually will get somewhere between 5 and 10 applications They get them emailed to them about 4 or 5 weeks before. And they'll put in somewhere between 20 or 40 hours to review those applications, score them, on a scale of 1 to 9 for all the criteria scores, and then submit those scores. And then after the reviewers actually submit those preliminary scores, they have the opportunity to see the other reviewer scores and say, oh, that other reviewer, reviewer 3 came up with some strengths I missed. Let me make my score better. Or, oh, they pointed out some weaknesses I missed. Let me make my score. So they call that recalibration. And then all the reviewers, once they have their final preliminary scores in, the scientific review officer will rank all of the applications in the pile, and then the bottom half gets cut off. So if you're in the bottom half of that pile, you get triaged to the infamous not discussed. And so if you ever submit an application and you get not discussed, that's what happened. It doesn't mean you had a bad application. It just means that for that particular panel, sort of depending on the competitiveness, the way they score, the luck of the draw with the reviewers, you just didn't score on the top half. If your application is in the bottom half, that's sort of the end of it, and the summary statements are just what they came up with. If you're on the top half, those are the applications that actually get discussed at the meeting when they actually assemble, again, either in person or lately it's been a lot on Zoom, but I think they're starting to go back to in person. And this is, I think, where the kind of interesting stuff happens. So your application will have 3 primary reviewers, sometimes 4 or 5, but usually it's 3. And those 3 people will be the only people in the room that have actually read your application in depth, okay? They each get to present to the room, and they usually get somewhere between 3 or 5 minutes to make their case. They explain your application, and they make their case about what they think the strengths and the weaknesses are and why they gave their score. After that, the entire room of reviewers listens thoughtfully, hopefully, if they're paying attention. And then they start to discuss. And all those people who are going to score you are scoring you based on what they heard from those 3 reviewers. And what that means is if someone loved your application and you spoke to them and they were like, this is the best thing since sliced bread, they're going to hopefully advocate for you. And if they didn't like your application, they are not going to advocate for you, or potentially worse, they're going to advocate against you. And so I think this is one of the really interesting pieces of this, and changed a lot about the way I write my applications, because your job is to get those 3 people who read it first to speak to an entire group and understand, be able to explain this, and love your application. Okay? So then everyone in the room gives you a score. They give you their overall impact score, and those scores are averages, and that's how you get the overall impact score that comes on your summary statements. Now, the reviewers have the option to update their critiques for a couple days, and then after that, the SRO will put together the summary statements. Now, while that room is discussing, right, while those reviewers are advocating for, hopefully for you, or advocating that maybe there's some weaknesses, whatnot, the chairperson is sitting there and frantically trying to type some coherent paragraph that explains what's happening in the room. And on your summary statement, that's called the summary of discussion. So that first really long paragraph, if everyone's seen a summary statement, I should put a summary statement up there, but there's a first really long paragraph that will explain the summary discussion in the room. And the reason that that's important is because you'll really get a flavor for whether there was consensus or not, right? Whether there was one, sort of bugaboo that people got hung up on that brought your score down, and it really will explain to you kind of how that discussion went. And so you'll often hear things like, enthusiasm was reduced because blank, or some people thought this was a strength, other people thought it was a weakness or whatever, and so that will kind of come together. And then that summary statement comes to you. And so typically it's going to be somewhere between a week to 30 days after that meeting meets. So you will know in ERA comments, it'll tell you when the study section is going to meet, and then what happens after that, right? 24 hours after that, you start hitting refresh, and every day you're in your browser and trying to see, but really it takes a little while for those summary statements to pop up, okay? And then you know exactly what they said, but it's not over. And so that is going to move to council, so I'm going to let Peter talk about council a little bit.
Awesome, thanks, Steph. I think from the two things that I, from listening to Steph, that are really important as she kind of talked about review panel is, remember these people are reading 5 to 10 of applications, and so if anything, it's a reminder to write very clearly, because they may not be physicians, they could be business people, they could be anybody really reviewing your application. So I think a lot of people don't say they had a grant that was rejected, and I have a mentor at Brigham who always tells me that there's never ever a grant that's been rejected, it's just been misunderstood. And I do strongly believe that it's really, it's just make sure you're really clear, and part of this will be to kind of hopefully demystify a little bit of that. So after your study section meets, you hopefully will get a score, or if you're like me, you'll get a lot of not discussed and feel really sad for yourself for several weeks. But what happens is all the grants that were scored will go to something called council. And so each institute has its own council where they make their funding decision. And there are several things that go into that. So there is first, how much budget? I think we're no, we're good. How much budget the institute has, and then some institutes will have what's called a pay line that you can look up, which will be kind of the mean or average score at which a grant is likely to get funded. But if anybody who's ever had NIH funding will tell you, never say you got a grant until you actually get a notice of award, because anything can happen in that period. This is the other place where it's really important to know your program officer. And so the program officers are assigned individuals at NIH at each institution, and you'll be assigned one of these people for each one of your grants. And these are the people that are really gonna go to bat for you. So they know your grants, they know your portfolio and who you are and what your research is. And what they can do is something called, they can rescue your grant. So say you got a really poor score, but you're doing something that is really within institute priorities that they really wanna see funded. If you have a really good PO, sometimes they will rescue that at council. So they'll discuss all the grants that are under the pay line they want to fund, and then they'll have an open opportunity where program officers can essentially rescue and say, hey, I really like this investigator, they're doing something that's really important and we need to fund this. And you can get something funded through that process as well. There are two kind of general stages to council. So each council is posted online. And you can actually join these and listen on council. And I think Christine has done this before. But there's the first section is like a open council where you get to hear about the year in review from the institute, their funding priorities. They may discuss what they want to fund next year. So it's a really good opportunity to start thinking about that. And then there's a closed section where the program officers and all the branch chiefs will meet and they'll make their funding decision. And then soon after that, hopefully you will see in ERA Commons that your grant switches from IRG or council review pending to either just pending, which is your first sign of good news that potentially your grant's gonna get funded, or nothing, which also may not mean anything as well. The other thing is that there's a very diverse group of people similar to study section on council. So you may have people who are community members, who may be business owners, and also researchers. There are also emergency physicians who sit on council as well. And so it's just kind of, I think the point to really emphasize is make sure you're very clear in your writing and write to kind of everybody, not just your kind of fellow cohort of researchers. So I will pass it on to Christine, right?
Sure, yeah. This last piece is just to say, thank you so much, thank you both. This last piece is to say that there is an Institute Center director who eventually looks at or signs off on every single grant. Just to contextualize that for people who are still newer to this, in the case of NIAID, which is the National Institute on Allergy, Immune and Infectious Diseases, it was for many years this person who we all came to know very, very well. And so it's kind of cool to know that like these very, very senior people eventually kind of get to know your name, especially if you continue to be funded within their institute or center. We had a lot of jargon that we were spitting out. This session is intentionally to target folks who probably have a little bit of experience or exposure to this. However, I did just want to pause to see if there are any questions or clarifications before we go on. Were there any like acronyms that people didn't understand, or any input from those who've had experience so far that you'd like to add at this point? I see a couple hands. Adam, I saw your hand go up first.
Maybe a good time to explain the difference between a score and a percentile.
A score and a percentile, great. I'm gonna give that to you.
Sure, yeah.
Let's take a couple questions and then we'll answer them. I think I saw a hand in the front next. Oh, okay, good.
Thank you for the presentation. My question is on resubmission. What happens during the submission stage?
Yeah, okay, great. Was there another question? Those were the three. Okay, do you want to do that one? I'll do the
sure.
resubmission one.
I don't need that, actually. So I think Adam's question was a good clarification point on score versus percentile. So you will get a score, and the lower the score, the better. But that is going to be your score that is essentially an average of what everybody on your review panel rates you as, or kind of gave you a score during a study section. And then for most grants, you'll be assigned a percentile. And so, your score may be, on a range from 1 to 100, which you won't get, but it will be, if you got like a 17, that might be like a 5th percentile or a 10th percentile. And it's really, when you look at your pay line at the institute, for most institutes, they will fund you based on your percentile. So it's not really your score, it's a percentile. Most of the time, your score does correlate with a percentile, and you have a sense, like if you have a decent score and you're within a good percentile, that it's a fundable grant. But I think, once again, nothing is ever kind of set in stone for sure until you get your notice. So.
I'll add just a couple of quick points to that. One is that not all grants get a percentile. So for example, K awards don't get a percentile. So for the longest time, I was like, what are these percentile things that people speak? They never happened on my grants because of the kind of grants I was applying for. The other is that every institute handles things a little bit differently. So like Peter and I do a lot of work through NIDA because of our toxicology work. And NIDA doesn't publish pay lines. So they will not say above or below a certain number or percentile we will fund. They're very vague about that. Other institutes, like I just applied to my newest grants with NIBIB, and they publish a pay line for all comers, and they publish a pay line for ESIs or early stage investigators, which is a little higher. So if you're an ESI, they'll give you a little more leeway, and it's actually, the pay line is different by about 5% or so. So like for example, NIBIB, I just happen to know this one, their pay line I think is like the 19th percentile. So if your grant is below the 19th percentile, you have a good chance of getting funded. If you're an ESI, their percentile is the 23rd. So, again, they give you a little bit more leeway as a newer investigator. But you guys, because emergency medicine, we don't have a real institute, right? Like everyone's going to be in different institutes, and so everything you hear us saying or people talk about the NIH in general, just take it with a grain of salt because every institute behaves a little bit differently. They're going to use a lot of the same terminology and the same like general hierarchy, but some of their policies will be slightly different.
Thank you guys, that's great. I was gonna, I was gonna emphasize the point about being an ESI, which means that you're 10 years from the last date of your highest level of education. For clinicians, MDs, that is residency. So if you're still within 10 years of graduating from residency, you get to point on this, basically a handicap, like it's golf, whereby even if your score is 10%, I think it's even up to 10%, they give you sort of like a handicap to allow you the opportunity, knowing that you've had less experience, less opportunity to build your team, 20 years of whatever else it is, to be able to give you an opportunity to get your first like independent grant.
And if you're a fellow, that counts as your last terminal degree.
Yeah.
So if you do fellowship, yeah.
And if you I got a PhD as part of my K, and my ESI started over again. So if I didn't get my R, I would be an ESI until I'm about 50. So, so just know, these are all kind of nuanced things, but just know the term ESI exists in Commons. It will say your ESI status and when it expires. But if you have any questions, just talk to your program officer because it's confusing. Some grants count against your ESI, and once you get them, like an R01, you're not an ESI anymore. Some grants don't. Like I've gotten SBIRs, I'm the PI on those, and they don't count. So those nuances, you just have to talk with your program officer, but kind of knowing the is really helpful, I think.
Exactly. Before your question on resubmission, small plug, we have another session tomorrow that's a much more foundational session to this. If you're swimming with some of the terms, PO, who is that? We're going to talk about PO next. ESI will be taking a lot more time to kind of handhold and do some practice on this tomorrow at the exact same time, different room, just look it up. On resubmission, the takeaway from that is always be resubmitting. I think I've seen on Twitter people have posted like I resubmitted 5 times, 7 times, and hopefully you won't have to spend that much time or work on perfecting your grant or having it be best understood, like or what Peter said, to reframe it. But sometimes it's necessary, and that's okay. I advise all my mentees to start getting into NIH submissions right away because I always find the feedback is usually something that like I either knew about and like was trying to cover up, or was something that was actually truly constructive. Very, very, very infrequently do I feel I've gotten sort of like petty or like unuseful or unhelpful advice in general. Like so, I always say like be resubmitting, and we'll talk about how to think about getting to start working on your resubmissions right away after you've heard your feedback on the next couple slides. Derek, you have a question?
I'm sure about ESI, whether it was after residency or fellowship.
Yeah, I should know.
And does that 10-year period apply for ESI across all institutes? Like,
Yes.
I believe
It's
so,
an
yeah.
NIH.
Yes, the only caveat is knowing like
What
which
particular
grants will take
grant.
you out of it or not. Like I've had R21s and those don't actually count, so I'm still like, it ends this year, so I need to get my R1s like
But there's also exceptions that extend your ESI status. So,
True.
For example, if you have children, it extends. There's extenuating circumstances around health that will extend your ESI status longer.
Children, like your youngest child, like from when you had your
No.
If you give,
Not a
yeah,
reason
if you're
to
on
have-
leave and stuff like that, yeah.
It's a great reason to have kids.
Yeah.
That's okay.
I was gonna say one more kind of, like, again, the ESI thing is so nuanced. You can get your ESI status taken away if you're an MPI on someone else's grants. So just know that your ESI status it's kind of like a one-time thing, right? You get that handicapped on one big grant, and so you want to use it wisely. And so, again, the nuances of when it gets taken away are kind of beyond the scope of this talk, but just be strategic about that, because that is the one that, you know, can make the difference between you getting an R01 and not, and you don't want to use it on someone else's grant that's not your, you know, sort of core focus.
Excellent. Yeah.
I might have missed it, but does it masters reset your ESI for an empty?
I don't think so.
I don't think
I
so.
don't think so.
I don't think so, yeah. But check and again, talk to your PO. We're gonna get to that. Did you have it? Okay, cool. So since all the questions are sort of leading to this, we've talked a little bit about the flow. You're gonna go through your first phase of review, which are peer reviewers, peer i.e. us, other academic scientists, clinician scientists who are doing the work, your council review, and then eventually a center director or institute director. This is a general schematic of what's going to hopefully happen as you're submitting and after you hit submit. Hopefully you're going to start somewhere in the realm of idea generation, right? You have a topic for a really cool intervention or idea that you've developed, a short-term behavioral intervention in the ED that you want to trial and test for efficacy, or some implementation science evaluation you want to do on that really smart intervention you've designed. And then you're going to look for an ideal mechanism or program, award. We've mentioned a lot of the big ones, R01, which is for the independent, generally on average slightly more senior researcher, an R21, which is usually to generate pilot or foundational data to get you to your R01. Maybe it's an R03. It could be any one of those or a different type of program. Sometimes, if you want to chase the funding, as they say, you can actually work backwards from that. So if you see a really interesting call that's so specific to your research, and I've done that before, I've finagled our team or our group to get something in and forced an idea into that based on it being a very specific call. So interesting idea to get on the various listservs that are for different institutes and talking to your POs regularly, your program officers regularly to figure out what's coming next, because sometimes they have projections even like 1, 2, or 3 years ahead based on their priorities, to let you know what kind of things you can start preparing for. We're all super busy, so you can plan ahead to like be ahead of the curve to start getting your submissions together. After you've got your idea, you've hopefully figured out the right mechanism or program or award to try and apply to, you're going to submit it, of course, hopefully before the deadline. Usually for most institutions, that's 2 weeks prior to the actual deadline. Some are stricter than others. Do as we say, not as we do. Hopefully you guys are always on time. I'm like a day before submitter, but it's okay. They still love me. So you're hopefully going to submit 2 weeks in advance. Usually your institution has some kind of review process they do for the first week to make sure it's logistically sound and you don't have hyperlinks where they're not supposed to be, and you have all the right documents and none of the wrong documents, etc. And then you'll be somewhere in this space waiting for a response. You're first going to be going through, again, like I said, your peer review, and then you're going to get your council review. But there are certain things you can do during that time period. And like I said before, hopefully, you're always getting back to resubmitting and your idea generation. The takeaway one of the big takeaways we all wanted to make sure you got from this session is to engage your program officer or officials very early on. Who is a PO? So a PO is an administrator of a grant or a grant program at the NIH, whose goal, as I heard quoted directly from a current institute center director, is to make you successful. Okay? Your PO is there to make you successful. That's your takeaway from today. And you can engage them at any and all points on this. You can think of them as a delegate from the NIH to communicate to you what's going on there. But also a liaison back to NIH if you have questions, comments, feedback, ideas for a new mechanism that you think would be really great. And they have ways of doing this regularly as well to use them for all of that. And your idea generation. Often there'll be a call, maybe a special announcement, maybe something even EM leaning, maybe a trauma-related call. And you might be like, hey, well, I don't know, some parts of the call fit my work, some parts don't really. I'm not sure if I'm in my ESI status or not. Right to the PO. Okay, so on the announcement, for each institute and center, each that's NCI or National Cancer Institute, Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, etc. There will be a contact at the bottom of each announcement. If you were to Google one, you'd see it today, or if you look later on. Also, you can go to each institute for what are called standard cycles. Those are like announcements that are there throughout the year. And they also have people that you can contact for each institute and center. And the good news is, if you're not sure, you can just start with one. And their goal is also to guide you to the right institute or center or the right contact, frankly. So don't be afraid to reach out to them. 99% of the time, they're super kind, super helpful. If you're nervous about like what to say to the PO, you can start with your mentor or mentors to say like, hey, how could or do you recommend engaging with them? But in general, again, all super helpful and willing to chat with you. What else I can add on this? Just want to make sure. So basically engaging them at each point of your process and even thereafter. The one that I do want to say, after you hit submit, you may have certain points in time, logistics around the submission that you might interact with what's called the SRO. You'll engage that once you submit. That's the scientific review official who is really kind of guiding or working with the chairperson of the committee from the NIH standpoint to make sure that the review committee is operating legally. They have adequate representation, enough EM people or trauma surgeons or whatever on the review committee, etc. So you might interface with them a bit during the peer review process, but you can always again go to your PO and they can funnel you to the SRO if needed. Okay, any questions on that or experiences with POs? Are there any POs in? I thought so. Aren't you Jeremy Brown? Okay, we'd love to hear from you. So sorry, we talk about you in our talk tomorrow. Sorry, we didn't put it to my slide. Do you want to? Yeah. So I mean, I can introduce you briefly, but I'd love for you to chat.
No, I just want to point one thing about the ESI. It's actually calculated by a computer. So,
do you want to introduce yourself first?
I'm Jeremy Brown. I was an ER doctor, and for the last 10 years I've run the Office of Emergency Care Research at NIH. So just to know, it's a calculated thing. And I guess if there are these exceptions that you pointed to, somehow they're manually entered, I don't know. But your PO would probably scratch her head and say, I don't know what your ESI status is, look it up in your, but just wanted to point that out.
Thank you. So talk to him after this.
Yeah. My question was in terms of initiating contact with your PO, how polished does your research idea need to be? Is it like a pitch? Is it a specific game sheet? Is it a full protocol?
Yeah, exactly. It's a good point. So in some, just do it. Just do it. But yes, a proper way, like if you really want to put your best foot forward, is to send a specific aims page at the idea level, or if you want to pitch to a particular mechanism that perhaps they have out. But you don't have to. Again, I have really great relationships with my POs. Like I said, 99% of the time, they're really just excellent people who are scientists. I think majority, if not all of them, have PhDs, frankly. Many of them were in your shoes, but they've decided to just be on the other end of the NIH and federal funding world to try to help get the right people in the right place and NIH to the right people as well. And they have been advocates. So speak to them, just speak to them candidly. And like I said, maybe sometimes I've had mentees who are super nervous about it. We'll just have a practice call, just modeling what it might look like, questions they might ask you. But again, they've been really excellent people. Thanks for that question. Any other comments or questions on? Yeah.
How early is too early? How late is too late to reach out to the PO?
Neither. Again, he said just repeat the question. How early is too early to reach out to the PO, and how late is too late? It's not. And frankly, like I said, once you get to the point of having a regular relationship with your PO, they sometimes they'll message you stuff, because they know you and your science so well. I have been so shocked being in certain rooms, just seeing how, even for me personally, how comfortable people are just with really cornering POs, to be quite frank. So other people are doing it, so go for it. We need it more in EM, and and I know Jeremy can say the same, just be available, be in their faces about stuff. If you have comments or questions about your reviews.
I think Christine,
just one point.
One more.
Oh yeah.
So I just wanted to add, first of all, you do not need to do a practice conversation.
You guys are scary.
A regular guy, and I think it's fair to say that all the POs that I've met, look, they're just a spread of human nature, right? So some themselves are shy, some themselves are, so it's fine. Second of all, you said how early or how late. I did the part of the grant writing workshop yesterday, and I think if people only remember one thing, it is always talk to the PO before you submit. Always. That should be a cardinal rule that nobody breaks. And just to explain why, I mean, there are so many nuances, and I can't tell you how many grants, and some from quite seasoned researchers I've seen that came in, so I'm surprised at them, for some reason it didn't fit, and we could have worked this all out. This could all be worked out, and I could tell you a better fit. For example, does pain, just a simple thing like, does pain go to neurological institute? Or does pain go to the mental health institute? And what if your outcome is depression, but you're treating pain? Who does that get? So there are all these little nuances that you may not have thought about, and POs, we don't want you to waste your time. So please, please, please reach out to the PO, and they will talk. And I think also about it's really helpful to get a summary, like with the email. I get a lot of emails. Can I talk to you about a project on headache? Yes, you can, but is it in mice? Is it in, what do we talk about? So send that page, and they may be able to say, this is great, you know what, my colleague down the road is actually a better person for this reason, and then that sort of helps. So try and be very specific if you can.
Great, perfect.
Yeah, I usually will send a mock draft of a specific aims page with like 4 or 5 bullet points of like, the things I want to get out of a call are, does this fit with the institute priorities? Does this fit within your portfolio? And can you suggest somebody else if it doesn't fit? And like, where's the best place for this to go? Because I think the best thing you can get from a PO early on, is Jeremy just suggested, is that you can get feedback on these specific aims pages, and the answer may be, this is not a fit for the institute. This is probably not going to get funded. So why spend all your time writing a 12-page R01 that's probably not going to go to the right place, when you can get it tweaked very early on, or you can rework that in different kind of strategic methods to get what you want to do done. So I think the POs are, I've always had really great interactions with POs, and they've been super helpful, so.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And I would just sort of echo the same and say I've had POs like, either say this isn't a right fit for our institute or for my portfolio. They've introduced me to other people. They've introduced me to other literature, and they're like, have you considered this? Because this is an important part of this field that I didn't even think about. But the other piece too is, as you establish that relationship, they'll start to reach out to you. And so I'll get emails from POs, be like, hey, this seems like a really great fit for you, or that sort of thing. And so, I've had excellent experiences for the most part, and it's been invaluable in helping me target and be efficient.
Perfect. Sorry, I saw your hand, Adam, but I wanted to add 2 more things that I didn't think about. For resubmission, one key point to get in touch with your PO at right away is, after you get your peer review score, just email them and set up a meeting to talk about R21, whatever it is, R01, whatever the label is, and the summary statement, and they'll know what that's for. And the whole goal for that is to, one, start planning ahead, because they were in the room and they generally have a sense on whether they're clearly going to advocate for you, or you're like a shoe-in, whether you're probably not going to get it this round, or whether you're somewhere in the middle. Okay, and the point of that is to, one, get a sense so you can start planning ahead to get your team together for the resubmission prep, to potentially help contextualize some of the responses that clearly disfavored you, or that favored you, to highlight those more. Or again, if you're a shoe-in potentially, then also understanding that and being able, although they're not going to be, until you get the notice, it's not a guarantee, but they'll give you a sense along that spectrum. Adam, do you want to add one last thing, and then we're going to try to wrap up?
Yeah, just really quick, I'll say, over the last 10 years, I've had a dozen different POs on different NIH submissions, and there is a huge range of variability in terms of how responsive they are.
Right.
And so it is not uncommon for you to email a PO and then not email you back, but don't be dissuaded.
Yeah.
Feel free to keep emailing them and reach out and see if they have a scheduler to schedule a meeting with them. It turns out that there's been no relationship that I've been able to discern between how well they respond to my emails and how much they'll advocate for me down the line. You just need to keep working at it.
Right. And before I pass on to Steph to close us off, I will say, sorry to be the bad scientist, I have not always emailed my PO before every submission. In fact, that's probably the minority of cases, and all my grants have been at least discussed. So, I mean, it's great. I think that's the proper and nice way for the PO to be able to also like position you well throughout, including picking an SRG or whatever else. But if you absolutely can't, like, still please do try to submit. Or like Adam said, you can't get a hold of somebody for some reason, still do submit. Let's keep going.
Yeah, let's do it. Yeah, we're doing okay on time, right?
We have like 5 minutes.
What's
that flu?
Oh, okay.
What happened?
Oh, what happened?
I have to fly through this part.
All right.
Yeah.
I don't know why this isn't. I'm gonna keep talking because we only have about 5 minutes left. So, do you want to talk about this at the end, and I can
Sure.
just talk about the next part, which is okay. So Christine mentioned one of the takeaways we want you all to sort of walk away with today is like call your PO, get in touch with them, engage them. There's another sort of action item that I would say again, if you don't remember any of this stuff, that I would encourage you to remember and do is that is to sign up to be a reviewer for the NIH if you can. So we talked a lot about reviewers coming from generally a pool of NIH-funded investigators, but there's another pathway that almost everyone in this room can at least apply for, called the Early Career Reviewer Program. The slides have a QR code, so if you can access the slides, I don't know what happens.
They're on the app. They should be on the app.
Yeah, they're on the app. If not, you can email me, and I'm happy to connect you. That's how I actually started reviewing. So the criteria, generally you have to be an early stage investigator, so you can't have big NIH grants, so you don't have to have any NIH grants at all. You have to have some research background and have some published some papers. But essentially you log on, you need an ERA Commons login, you send them your CV and a brief description, and then if you get selected, they eventually call you to sit on a study session, and it's really cool. The first time you go, they'll give you like 2 applications, and they make you reviewer 3, so there's like very little pressure, right? You just get to kind of sit in and absorb it and understand how this process goes. And then if you do 2 or 3 like that, you end up just getting called all the time. So that's kind of how I got started on this, and I have ended up, like I said, I've done probably about 15 in the last 5 years, and it's fantastic. So I advocate for everyone here who haven't done it already, sign up. There's no obligation. Like if they call you and you can't do it, that's fine. But it's a phenomenal opportunity. I think it's a really sort of transitional point in your sort of career as a grant writer and a researcher to be able to sit on that side of the table and understand the science. And it's also just really great for networking, especially when it's in person. You get to meet all these other investigators and talk with them about their processes. So I think that's what I wanted to say there, right?
Yep.
Cool. All right, and you're gonna.
Yeah. So apologies for the slides, but I think in conclusion, hopefully this session kind of emphasized really the diversity of at least the structure of what it looks like after you click submit. I think the main takeaways here are that there's a huge diversity of experience in your review panel, and please write to everybody, not just to yourself. Communication with the program officer is highly, highly important, as you've heard from all of us and from a lot of other people. Really getting to know them and know the priorities. They can be a huge advocate for you both during study section and afterwards in council. And please, if anybody does anything after today's session, it's go on the NIH website and become an early career reviewer. I did this when I got my K, and it's been huge. It's been a hugely important experience because you really start to learn how people are thinking in these panels, and what kind of writing makes sense to these people and what doesn't. And it's really, at least for me, it's really helped tailor the way I write grants and kind of how I think about the grant review process. So, thank you all. I know Ed, you had a comment. I know we didn't get to you earlier.
I was just wondering if it makes sense to go over the difference between a PA and an RA.
Do you want to do that now or?
Yeah, sure. So I think maybe you're getting at like standard cycle, and the fact that there's always standing grants available through NIH. These, we call them like parent grants. For each, well, not all of the mechanisms, but some of them. So R1, R21, R03, which is like a smaller size grant, and a variety of others, and they have standard dates. It's like, I always forget them, but it's like January, somewhere in the summer, July, and then like October. And you can always apply to those announcements at any given time. And like I said, finagling ideas into mechanisms, and making an argument for why your project fits into that institute's mission or strategic priority. Whereas RFAs or RFPs, like these are requests for announcements, requests for proposals, are things that come up ad hoc. During COVID, for example, COVID-19, there were a ton of like requests for proposals from like basic scientists and others on ways to improve outcomes for COVID-19. I'm in global health, so a lot of my stuff like comes out as RFAs. I think that's what you're getting at.
Well, yeah, there's a little bit of subtlety there. I mean, program announcements are things that research areas at NIH has determined is cool to investigate. RFAs, RFPs are things that NIH wants to know about now, which means that they've got money set aside now. So regarding the question, is it too early, is it too late to talk to the program officer? If you've got an RFA, it's usually a 3-month deadline, it's a one-time deal for a lot of them. You've got to talk to the program officer now. So there is some time in the grant review world where a grant submission world where you want to hop on it today, drop all other tasks, and focus on getting the grant produced as efficiently as possible.
Exactly. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, I'll say I was the naive person because it's okay to be naive and ask us questions, communicate with us, others in the room who've shared. I used to think you could only apply for NIH grants through RFPs. Like I actually thought that, which is so crazy. But it's also important to know that there are these standing cycle grants that you can always apply for. So talk to your mentors, get your teams ready for those different cycles, and you can actually plan your life out to apply for those. With that, we're right at time. So thank you guys. It's been so cool working with you.
Yeah, same. Thank you guys.
Yeah. These are my department.